this week's Torah portion is a double portion. It's Tazriah and Metsorah. We're going to be going over Leviticus 12 through 15. So, do what? Yeah, we're reading like normal. It's only 4 chapters. What we'll probably wind up doing is doing 12, 13, and 14, and then release the kids for any of them who want to leave, and then we'll do the last chapter. It's not a nice chapter. It's dealing with stuff, you know. All right, let's recap what we went over last week, where we're at. So last week we saw Aaron and his sons took on the role of priests and consecrated themselves. We saw Aaron's oldest 2 sons bring unauthorized fire into the tabernacle, and Yah killed them on the spot. And we talked about what all that meant. If you weren't here last week, you can go on YouTube and check out that video. It's pretty neat Torah portion to talk about. We talked about Yah having a prescribed method for service to Him, and we don't get to do things our way. And then we saw Yah's order and guidelines for what was to be considered food. We wrapped up with the Levitical food laws last week. Well, that's kind of how we ended it. So that was pretty cool. So that's where we're at. We're jumping into Leviticus 12. Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, instructing, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she will be unclean for 7 days, as in the days of her nadah. She will be unclean." That word nadah there is just the days of her cycle. "In the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin is to be circumcised. She must wait during the blood of purification for 33 days. She is not to touch any holy thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she will be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her nadah, and she is to wait in the blood of purification for 66 days. When the days of her purification are completed, for a son or for a daughter, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. He is to present it before Adonai and make atonement for her. Then she will be cleansed from the discharge of her blood. This is the Torah for her who gives birth, whether to a male or a female child. If she cannot afford a lamb, then she is to bring 2 turtle doves, or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. Then the Kohen, the priest, will make atonement for her, and she will be clean." So let's keep in mind, it's so easy to forget, unclean does not equal sin. So there can be uncleanness. Girl, where's my Chick-fil-A? There can be uncleanness that doesn't necessarily equate sin. So I think it's really interesting. We see this 7-day, 8th day thing going on here with the male child. So the 8th day was the day of circumcision, and circumcision was established back in Genesis. So circumcision had already been established before this came out. So I think it's interesting that God was like, well, if she's going to take him to get circumcised, how is she supposed? If she's not clean yet, how is she supposed to enter the temple to get him to get circumcised? So we also see, though, that the female child requirements were longer. Anybody study it this week and find out why? Why was it longer for a female? If she had a female child, she was unclean for 14 days, and then her extended time was 66 days versus 7 and 33.
I remember we studied this before, and it was she was acting to cover both her and her daughters.
Yeah. So.
Like the theory.
So. There's a couple of thoughts and theories on this. One is that a male child was highly prized. Like if you had a male child, that was who carried on your name, your lineage. So it was very highly prized to have a male child. So one of the thoughts, especially in rabbinical teachings, is that this was a way that Yah forced the family to take more time with the daughter. Almost like you're going to spend more time with her to make sure she's just as loved as if you had a male child. So there was that more of a family bonding that took place with that 66 days versus 33 days. The other is kind of what Abby was touching on, is that since we're all born into this world sinners, right? We're all born into the world sinners. But if you had a female child would then be able to grow up and produce more sinners. She would bring in more sinners into the world. So the thought was a longer day of cleansing, a longer day of purification to, like Abby said, to kind of cover the fact that she had the potential to also bring in more sinners into the world. So then we see...
And two, the fact that she was a woman, so like covering her future cycle. I remember reading that as well. Like it wasn't about sinners.
The only thing I found on that when I was studying that out had to do with the fact that it was that, but it very well could be. I mean,
we've also talked about, I know we had some discrepancies on this, but like sometimes with girls who have girls, it's harder and longer recovery. Not always. I think Erica used it. It wasn't the case with your girls. In hindsight, I feel like it was just like some interesting.
Yeah.
I was like looking at it from the aspect that y'all put those in place to protect the woman, not that she was
absolutely
wrong or shameful or bad.
Well, we see that a lot in the Torah. We'll see a lot of laws and rules directed towards women, and I feel like that's a kind of a loophole that a lot of anti-Torah uses to say, oh look, God's a chauvinist. He's just making these rules for the women. Except for a lot of times, they were actually put in place to help protect them. So for this, it's not that she has to do this stuff because anything was wrong. She gets 33 days. She actually gets 40 days off. Like, how cool is that? You know, he actually put that in there to say, hey, look, rest. You just had a baby. Like, rest. Take some time off. Because during that period, she would have had people serving her. They would have been bringing her food, and there were certain things, especially during the first 7 or the first 14, she wouldn't have been allowed to go out of the house and go to the temple or the tabernacle. So there's little things in there that are going on that we can see where God was actually protecting the females. It's not just pointing fingers at them.
And it also shows in how he had a tender spot for widows and orphans.
Yeah,
I mean, if they were of no value, you know, then it would have been, whatever, you're on your own. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, it's Yahweh's way of showing extra, almost compassion and love towards them. Yeah. So then we get to this part of the sacrifices. So it's interesting because we see that they were supposed to bring a burnt offering and a sin offering. And the sin offering, I've actually heard some teach that another word for that is the offering of atonement. So there's an atoning offering. But we look at that like, okay, so if what was going on, her being unclean, wasn't a sin, why did she need to bring a sin offering? Yeah, it's not a rhetorical question. We have very few rhetorical questions.
That was my question.
So if she wasn't sinning and her uncleanness wasn't for sin, then why did she need to bring a sin offering? No. So uncleanness just means, so for instance, she wasn't allowed to go to the tabernacle. She couldn't approach Yah's presence because she was unclean. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was a sin involved. So unholiness would be sin. Uncleanness just means, so for instance, if you touched the carcass of a dead animal, you became unclean. And you had to wait till evening and take a bath, you know. So in this instance, the burnt offering was for her to restore her purification. The sin offering was to cover the atonement of the child. And it's such a cool picture. I was thinking about this as I was studying this out. It's such a cool picture of Yeshua. Before we were even in existence, He's already covered. He's already made that atonement for us.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
But it could also be because giving birth and all that can make you more susceptible or vulnerable to receiving infections.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know, sicknesses, fevers,
Yeah.
viruses, and things like that. So that might have been a guarantee that you wouldn't carry that sort of thing into the temple.
Yeah.
You know, and make other people sick.
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely.
Or you yourself catch something being out in the public.
Yeah.
That's so vulnerable after having a baby. I remember not being ready to go anywhere for a good month after having kids.
Yep. So it's such a neat picture of Yeshua seeing that before that child has even gotten to the age where it can sin, even though it's born into sin, that sin offering, that atonement offering, was already made to begin the process of atonement, even before he had reached the age where he would have to, or she would have to, atone for her sins or his sins. Any questions on chapter 12? Before we move on to chapter 13. All right, chapter 13. Darren, you want to read?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not up to it, man.
He's over here choking.
Oh, don't choke.
All right.
You want to put this in?
I just did that. That's what choked me. Excuse me. Then Adonai spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, when a man has a swelling on the skin of his body, or a scab, or a bright spot, and it becomes a plague mark of Tazriah in his flesh, and he shall be brought to Aaron the Cohen, or to one of his sons, the Kohanim. The Cohen is to examine the plague of, how do you say that? Zera on his skin, and the hair of the plague has turned white. And the appearance of the plague is deeper than the body's skin. It is the plague of Zera. Thus the Cohen should examine him and pronounce him unclean. If the bright spot is white in the skin of his body, but its appearance is not deeper than the skin, and its hair is not turned white, then the Cohen is to isolate the infected person for 7 days. The Cohen should examine him on the 7th day, and behold, if he sees the plague is not spread in the skin, the Cohen is to isolate him for 7 more days. The Cohen is to examine him again on the 7th day, and behold, if the plague has faded and has not spread in the skin, then the Cohen shall pronounce him clean. It is a scab. He is to wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab spreads on the skin after he has shown himself to the Cohen for his cleansing, he is to show himself to the Cohen once again. The Cohen is to examine him, and if the scab is spread on the skin, then the Cohen shall pronounce him unclean. It is Zera. When one has a plague of Offsarat, he is to be brought to the Cohen. The Cohen is to examine him, and behold, if there is white swelling in the skin, and it has turned the hair white, and if there is raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic Zera in the skin of his flesh, and the Cohen is to pronounce him unclean. He is to isolate him, for he is unclean.
All right, so this was like the original 14 days to flatten the curve, right? That's basically what
Yeah.
Too soon, is it?
No,
I mean, so this is what it is. So let's talk about this for a second. Because I feel like this is probably one of the most understood, misinterpreted words almost in Scripture. This idea of Zerat. So most modern translations translate this as leprosy. If you do any study on this word, you'll find that most scholars will agree that it is not leprosy. Leprosy is a generalized English word they use to describe this. And there are two different camps on this word. One is that it is leprosy and that it is a strictly physical disease, ailment that happens on your skin, visible. The other camp is that it is strictly a spiritual affliction that it takes place. So you have most of your modern translators that are on this side of its leprosy, and most of your Judaic rabbis and scholars will tell you that it is strictly a spiritual affliction. From studying this out, I almost feel that it's both. That it is something that could start in the spirit and become a fleshly evidence fleshly. And I also think that it's something that should be treated both from studying this out, and as we see, if this was strictly a spiritual affliction, then why would they isolate them? Right? If this was strictly a physical, then there wouldn't need to be a ritual cleansing, a ceremonial cleansing that would take place to take care of it. So I think after studying this out, that it's both. It has the potential to be both. It's something that they would have had to have dealt with on a physical level because it was contagious. Obviously, they had to isolate them. But we're going to see in a little bit where it talks about it being on the house and other places that it could take place, which also shows that there's probably a spiritual aspect of this too. And as I was studying this out this week and really trying to dig deep, and I looked at a bunch of different sources so that I could try to get a full picture of what's going on here. And it almost made me think of, how do we translate this into modern idea? Like, how do we associate this with our life application now? And it made me think of how many times do we take sickness and disease and we just focus on, oh, I'm gonna fix this physically, when maybe there's an underlying spiritual issue that's going on. Or the opposite of that, I know people that anytime they get a physical affliction, they automatically just go like, spiritual warfare, let's take this, it's a devil that's doing this, we gotta fix this, we're going straight, and they don't ever think about any type of supplements or things to help their physical body. It's just always spiritual stuff. So as we're going through the rest of this, especially 13 and 14, think about that. Like, how are we handling, how do we apply this to our lives today? You know, yes, there are physical things we need to do, but I also believe that there's things that are happening in the spirit realm that we don't know, we can't perceive, and there's things at work that we need to think of and let the Ruach really speak to us about, okay, this is what's going on, what's the root of it? And let the Spirit speak to us and navigate us in the direction that we need to handle things. Babe, you want to pick up on verse 12?
Yes. Remind me how to say the word again?
Zerat.
Zerat. Suppose the zerat breaks out above the flesh, and so far as it appears in the eyes of the Kohen, covers all the skin of the infected person from his head to his feet. Then the Kohen will see and behold if the zerat has covered all of his body. He is to pronounce him clean of the plague. Since it has all turned white, he is clean. But whenever raw flesh appears on him, he will be unclean. And the Kohen is to examine the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean. When raw flesh is unclean, it is zerat. Or if in the raw flesh changes and turns white, then he must come to the Kohen. And the Kohen is to examine him, and behold, if the plague has turned white, then the Kohen should pronounce him clean of the plague. He is clean. When the body has a boil on its skin and it's healed, but in the place of the boil there is a white swelling or a bright reddish white spot, then it shall be known to the Kohen. The Kohen is to examine it, and behold, if its appearance is lower than the skin and its hair has turned white, then the Kohen is to pronounce him unclean. It is a plague of zerat that has broken out within the boil. But if the Kohen examines it and sees there are no white hairs within, and if it is not deeper than the skin, but is faded, then the Kohen is to isolate him 7 days. If it spreads in the skin, then the Kohen is to pronounce him unclean. It is a plague. If the bright spot stays in its place and is not spread, it is merely the scar from the boil. The Kohen is to pronounce him clean. Or suppose that the body has a burn from fire on its skin, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish, white, or white. Then the Kohen is to examine it, and behold, if the hair on the bright spot has turned white, and its appearance is deeper than the skin, it is zerat. If it is broken out in the burning, and the Kohen is to pronounce him unclean, it is the plague of zerat. But if the Kohen examines it and sees there is no white hair in the bright spot, and is not lower than the skin, but is faded, then the Kohen is to isolate him 7 days. The Kohen is to examine him on the 7th day. If it has spread in the skin, then the Kohen is to pronounce him unclean. It is the plague of zerat. If bright spot stays in its place and has not spread in the skin, but is faded, it is a swelling from the burn. And the Kohen shall pronounce him clean, for it is merely a scar from the burn. When a man or a woman has a plague on the head or on the chin, then the Kohen is to examine the plague, and behold, if its appearance is deeper than the skin, and the hair in it is yellow and thin, then the Kohen is to pronounce him unclean. It is a scab of zerat, of the head or the chin. If the Kohen examines the plague of the scab and beholds its appearance is no deeper than the skin, and then there is no black hair within, then the Kohen is to isolate the person infected with the scab for 7 days. On the 7th day, the Kohen is to examine the plague and behold. If the scab has not spread and there is no yellow hair in it, and the appearance of the scab is no deeper than the skin, then he should be shaved, but he is not to shave the scab. And the Kohen is then to isolate the one who has the scab for 7 more days.
So what we need to do now is we're gonna have a book. We're gonna make a little book, and it's gonna have all these descriptions. All right. When everybody starts coming in on Friday nights, we're gonna look you over, make sure you're not showing the scabs that are inset and you got white hairs growing out. I mean, this is just such a beautiful chapter. I mean, I just love stuff like that.
It kind of makes me wonder, like, if they did this for, like, teenagers when they got acne, so that they could, like, know, it's normal, it's okay, you don't have to, it's not a plague, it's just...
Yeah. It's like, no, it's a scab, it's not Zera, it's okay.
It's a boil.
You got burned, it's okay, it's okay. Yeah.
Sounds like they're being trained to become dermatologists.
Yeah.
Can you imagine everybody walking around like,
Yeah.
what are you doing? You got it? You got Zera? You got Zera? You got Zera? Who's got Zera? You got
It must have
Zera?
been a real plague, a real.
Yeah. You imagine being a family member and found like your brother. You'd be like, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody.
Well, I mean, boils are apparently really contagious because they're a staph infection.
Yeah.
So, like...
It sounds like poison ivy to me, which is spread everywhere.
Well, and again, let's think about we've said this the past couple weeks. Remember this: God is smarter than we are, so He's setting things in place because He knows what's coming, He knows what's going to happen, and He's taking care of His people.
So it seems sort of like the Zera is a broad general term for things you could have wrong with your skin.
Yeah. So yes. So like I said, a lot of times it's translated as leprosy, but really I feel like not that we could use this word for it, but it's almost like a virus. So if you say virus, what kind of virus? Different kinds of virus. So Zera, it's kind of the same thing. Let's say, okay, well, Zera is a broad term for a lot of different obvious skin defects that could take place. And then we know just what we just talked about, that there's a spiritual side to this too. So there's a spiritual underlying that could take place causing physical ailments.
And it was probably more common because it was an agricultural society, and it was also ranching and farming. Things that you probably could pick up from handling sheep or cattle, or
Yep.
that may have been something that came by that. So
Mhm.
and it's just why it's so foreign to to us is because we don't live in that type of.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. We as we're going to continue on in the Torah, we see all these things, these guidelines set out for different ailments, different diseases, different things. But then once we get to Deuteronomy, before they go into the Promised Land, He's going to tell them, look, if you follow my commands and ordinances, then you won't be sick. I'll keep these plagues off of you. So this is obviously something that they're discovering in their wilderness journey.
The sin,
Yeah, this it does has that attachment to sin and to spiritual health. D, you want to pick back up?
Yeah, 33 or 34.
34.
On the 7th day, the Kohen is to examine the scab, and behold, if the scab has not spread in the skin, and its appearance is no deeper than the skin, then the Kohen shall pronounce him clean. He is to wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab spreads in the skin after his cleansing, then the Kohen is to examine him, and behold, if the scab is spread in the skin, the Kohen may not look for the yellow hair, he is unclean. But if he sees the scab is stopped, and black hair is grown in it, the scab is healed, and he is clean. The Kohen should pronounce him clean. Suppose a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, bright white spots. Then the Kohen is to examine them, and behold, if the bright spots on the skin of their body are a dull white, it is a harmless rash broken out in the skin. He is clean. Well, I'm glad my little headline here says baldness is clean.
Yes. So I joked with Abby about making you read this, and I totally forgot that I joked about that, and then I just asked you to read it. So
That's fine.
40.
If a man's hair is fallen from his head, he is bald. Duh. I'm kidding. He is clean.
Yeah, Mr. Clean.
okay, he's good. You don't see he's a rock in his head.
That's why they call him Mr. Clean, right?
Yeah.
Mr. Clean.
Or if the borders of his face become bald, his forehead is bald, he is clean. But if on the bald head or bald forehead there is a reddish-white plague, it is Zera breaking out in his bald head or bald forehead. Then the Kohen is to examine him, and behold, if the rising of the plague is reddish-white on his bald head or bald forehead, like the appearance of the Zera in the skin of the flesh, he is a man with Zera. He is unclean. The Kohen should definitely pronounce him unclean. His plague mark is on his head. The one with Zera who has the plague mark shall wear torn clothes. The hair of his head is to hang loose. He is to cover his upper lip and cry, "Unclean, unclean." All the days during which the plague is on him, he will be unclean. He is unclean. He is to dwell alone. Outside of the camp will be his dwelling. Also, when a garment has a mark of Zera on it, whether it is a woolen or a linen garment, whether it is woven or textured, linen or wool, leather or anything made from leather, or if the mark is greenish or reddish within the garment or in the leather, or in the weaving or the texture, or in anything made from leather, it is the plague of Zera, and shall be shown to the Kohen. The Kohen is to examine the plague and isolate it for 7 days. Then he is to re-examine the plague on the 7th day. If the plague is spread in the garment, either in the weaving, the texture, or the leather, whatever the use for the leather may be, the plague is a destructive mildew. It is unclean. He is to burn the garment, or the weaving, or the texture, wool, or linen, or anything of leather in which the plague resides, for it is a destructive mildew. It is to be burned in the fire. If the Kohen examines it, and behold, the plague is not spread in the garment, either in the weaving, the texture, or anything made of leather, the Kohen shall command that they wash the thing which has the mark, and he is to isolate it 7 more days.
So this is interesting, I think, because I think this goes on to show kind of the spiritual nature of this plague of Zera. Because, okay, so they've got clothing. They are in an arid environment, in a desert. They don't have air conditioning. They don't have dehumidifiers. The potential for their clothes to get wet and just grow normal mildew, I feel, would be high if they don't take care of this, right? But seems like it's talking about something very specific and very different. Even though it uses the term destructive mildew here, it almost alludes to there's something a little bit different about this, that there is a spiritual nature to it. Like, how did this get here? Because mildew, yes, it spreads, but I mean, it does take time for it to grow and build. This seems a little bit different. Just throwing that out there. I can't say I necessarily have the exact answer for that, but I feel like this is alluding to something more than just what we would think of as standard mildew from clothing getting wet and sitting in the damp, dry place.
I would want to say too, from the physical aspect of it, we know now that like if a home has mildew like behind the walls, it poisons you slowly and makes you very, very sick.
Yeah.
So you see with the common sense there.
Yeah.
As well, and they didn't have dryers. You know.
Everything would have got air dried. Yeah.
Everything would have been air dried. So I like it that you can really see both.
Well, in dry or arid climates, like say in Arizona or Utah and all those areas, you know, even in the feces of like say rats or vermin or anything, fungus can be pretty aggressive.
Yeah.
Aggressively grows in it, and it separates and blows through the air as a
Yeah,
spore,
those spores, yeah.
and which can also attach itself to you, you know, and you can, you know, and it can aggressively grow on because our bodies put out moisture. You know, it's going to thrive wherever there's moisture.
Yep.
So that could also be part of what that may have been.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's continue on. 55. Then the Kohen is to re-examine it after the mark has been washed, and behold, if the mark has not changed its color and is not spread, it is unclean. You are to burn it in the fire, whether the rot is inside or outside. If the priest looks and sees the mark has faded after it has been washed, then he is to tear it out of the garment, or the leather, or weaving, or texture. But if it appears again in the garment, either in the weaving, the texture, or anything made of leather, it is spreading. You are to burn with fire whatever has the mark. The garment or weaving or texture or whatever leather item it is that you have washed, if the mark has departed from it, is to be washed a second time and will be clean. This is the Torah for a mark of Zera in a garment of wool or linen, either in the weaving, the texture, or anything of leather, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean. So, I mean, right there we see that, like, if it was actual, like you're saying, mildew, and it's got spores, the best way to handle that is burn it.
Yeah.
We just get rid of it. Especially in that, they didn't have antibacterial soaps and, you know, all these special mildew treatments that we have today. If it got mildew on it and you wash it and you couldn't get rid of it, burn the thing, because it's going to keep spreading. And I do like how he says, like, if you wash it and it goes away, wash it again. Just make sure.
Redundant. Yeah.
Yep, let's make sure that thing is clean. Any questions on 13? I know these aren't the most awe-inspiring chapters, but I love that there's stuff like this in here, because it really just continues to push the fact that God does everything with a purpose. Yah's got a purpose for what He's doing, and whether or not we see it does not mean there's not purpose there. So, I mean, as many times as we've gone through the Torah portion and through these Torah cycles, every time something else comes up. Every year you study this, you're going to see new things, and Yah's going to show you. The Ruach's going to reveal more stuff to you. And so I know it gets boring, but I love these chapters.
I just like it's really practical.
Yes.
Like I just like that Yah cares about the practical aspects of life as well.
Yep.
And that you don't feel sick.
Well,
He just shows His heart is that you're well.
Yeah.
And not breathing in and living in homes with rotting
Well,
walls.
he told the children of Israel He would take care of them.
Yeah.
And taking care of them doesn't mean just that they get sick, He's going to heal them. It means He's going to give them the tools necessary to prevent sickness. It's the very first preventative medical treatment. You know, that's what it is. He's preventing it, and I just love that it's right there. I heard somebody say this week that the Torah is the principles for living a good life. And it's little things like that show that God really cared about the minor details, and that He really did want to take care of them.
And we can see that when Florence hit here. I don't know where y'all were during Florence.
Oh, remember Florence? But we're in Florida.
Okay, well it was real bad.
It was terrible here.
It was the worst. I've been here 25 years. It's the worst.
Yeah, I just talked to a brother the other day about it. He said it just dumped rain and dumped it.
And flooded, and we were trapped. And Wilmington was an island, and there was no way in and no way out. And homes were flooded the entire first floor. They had never flooded before here, and that was the main thing that everyone was trying to figure out. How do we deal with the mold? Because they're like, bleach only takes the color away. It doesn't actually stop it from growing. And so people were sending out like recipes and how to use vinegar and how to kill it. And you had to wear special suits to get all the stuff out of the house because it was filled with mildew and
Spores, all the
sewage.
spores, yeah.
I invested in a machine. It's actually what hotels use. The ionizer and everything.
Oh, cool.
It works amazing. But
Yep.
our whole house was completely covered in black mold. The ceilings and everything. It got so bad. We couldn't find somebody to fix it. Served for a month and then they wouldn't
Yeah.
So you understand
talk to our
Yeah.
insurance.
the urgency of mold.
Yeah, but it's so neat to, as we're studying on the Torah, to see not only the great spiritual aspects of Yah, but the practicality, the things He puts in place. Is like, well, duh, that makes sense. That's why it baffles me sometimes when people are like, oh, you don't have to do that anymore. Why would you not want to? Like, it's practical. It's good stuff.
That would be like saying if you had a rash that's like moving up your body and you don't go to the doctor to have it checked. No, you need to know what to do with it.
Or like,
It
you know,
changes.
if you're sick at home, throwing up, stay home.
Yeah.
That's what this is talking about. It's separate yourselves. All right, let's keep going. Leviticus 14. We're going to see some more about this Sarat. Anybody else want to read?
I can do it again.
Go ahead, D.
Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, This is the Torah of the one with Sarat in the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the Kohen. And the Kohen is to go to the outside of the camp. The Kohen is to examine him, and behold, if the mark of the Sarat is healed in one with Sarat, then the Kohen is to command that 2 clean living birds, cedar wood, scarlet, and hyssop, be brought for the one being cleansed. The Cohen shall command them to kill one of the birds in a clay pot over living water. As for the living bird, he is to take it, the cedar wood, the scarlet, and the hyssop, and dip them with the living bird into the blood of the bird that was killed over the living water. He is to sprinkle on the one being cleansed from the Serat 7 times and pronounce him clean. Then release the living bird over the open fire. The one to be cleansed must wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and bathe himself in water. Then he shall be clean. After that he may come into the camp, but is to dwell outside his tent for 7 days. Then on the 7th day he is to shave all his hair from his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. He must shave off all his hair. He is to wash his clothes and bathe in his body in water. Then he will be clean. On the 8th day he is to take 2 male lambs without blemish, a 1-year-old ewe lamb without blemish, 3/10 of a pint of fine flour as a grain offering, mingled with oil, and a pint of oil. The Cohen who cleanses himself is to set the man who is to be cleansed along with those items before Adonai, at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The Cohen shall then take one of the male lambs and offer it for a trespass offering with the pint of oil, and wave them as a wave offering before Adonai. Then he is to slaughter the male lamb in the place where they slaughter the sin offering and the burnt offering in the sanctuary area. For the sin offering, like the trespass offering, belongs to the Cohen. It is most holy. Then the Cohen is to take some of the blood of the trespass offering and dab it on the tip of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot.
Hold on. So let's stop there a second. Interesting things going on here. One, we see almost every offering and sacrifice mentioned.
Yeah.
So there's obviously this Zerat has got a lot more to do with the spiritual than I think modern translators give it credit for. Why would all of these different offerings have to take place after his cleansing? Interesting, we read there a second ago, 2 birds were brought, 1 was killed, the other one was set free. What does that sound like? The scapegoat for an atonement. Good job, man.
I know this story.
You know, very picturesque of the scapegoat for the Day of Atonement, right? And then we see all of the different offerings. We see the trespass offering, the sin offering, a burnt offering, all these different things going on. And then we see the whole thing with the blood on the ear, the thumb. It's the same thing that happened to the priest. So there's a lot of ceremonial purification that's taking place. So I think that also hints to the fact that this Zerat has got more to do spiritually than most people give it credit for. I just want to point that out while we're still right there.
As there's the application of blood on the individual.
Yep.
You know, and pointing to Yeshua.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So there's definitely more to this Zerat than just simple disease of leprosy. Keep going.
The Cohen shall then take some of the pint of oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand. He is to dip his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand and sprinkle some of the oil with his finger 7 times before Adonai. Then the Cohen shall dab some of the rest of the oil that is in his hand on the tip of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on top of the blood of the trespass offering. From what remains of the oil that is in his hand, the Cohen is to dab on the head of the one being cleansed. In this way the Cohen will make atonement for him before Adonai. The Cohen shall offer the sin offering and make atonement for the one being cleansed because of his uncleanness. Afterward he is to slaughter the burnt offering.
So we see now he's putting oil on his ear as well. So we've got blood and oil. I feel like there's some sort of a picture going on there of Yeshua and the Ruach. So you've got blood and you've got anointing.
Yeah.
So there's something going on there that, again, we're alluding back to this Zerat being way more spiritual than what most people think it is.
Then the Cohen is to present the burnt offering along with the grain offering on the altar. So the Cohen shall make atonement for him, and he will be clean. If he is poor and cannot afford so much, Then he shall take one male lamb for a trespass offering to be waved, to make atonement for him, plus 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mingled with oil for a grain offering, a pint of oil, 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, such as he is able to afford. The one shall be a sin offering and the other a burnt offering. On the 8th day he is to bring them to the Kohen for his cleansing, at the entrance of the tent of meeting before Adonai. The Kohen is to take the lamb of the trespass offering and the pint of oil and wave them for a wave offering before Adonai. He is to slaughter the lamb of the trespass offering. The Kohen is to take some of the blood of the trespass offering and dab it on the tip of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The Kohen shall then pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand. He is to sprinkle with his right finger some of the oil that is in his left hand 7 times before Adonai. Then the Kohen is to dab some of the oil that is in his hand on the tip of the right ear of the one being cleansed, also on the thumb of his right hand and the big toe of his right foot, on top of the place of the blood of the trespass offering. Rest of the oil that is in his hand, the Kohen is to dab on the head of the one being cleansed, to make atonement for him before Adonai. He is to offer one of the turtle doves or the young pigeons from what his hand can afford, the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering with the grain offering. The Kohen shall make atonement for him being cleansed before Adonai. This is the Torah for one on who is the mark of Zera, who is not able to afford the sacrifice for his cleansing.
So that right there, so that kind of, now we've covered that is the Zera on a person and how they were cleansed from it. So now we're going to continue on and look how Zera affects other things. You good to keep reading? You want me to?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Adonai spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, Suppose you have come into the land of Canaan, which I give to you for a possession, and I put a mark of Zera in a house in the land you possess. Then the one who owns the house shall come and tell the Kohen, saying, Something like a mark has appeared in my house. The Kohen is to order the house empty before he goes in to examine the mark, so that nothing in the house might be made unclean. Then afterward the Kohen is to enter to inspect the house. He is to examine the mark, and behold, if the mark is in the walls of the house with the hollow streaks, greenish or reddish, and appears deeper than the wall, then the Kohen is to go out of the house to the door and close up the house for 7 days. Then the Kohen is to come again on the 7th day, and behold, if the mark is spread in the walls of the house, then the Kohen is to command that they take out the stones which are marked and throw them into an unclean place outside of the city. He shall also have the inside of the house scraped all throughout, and they are to dump the mortar that they scraped off outside of the city into an unclean place. They may then take other stones and put them in the place of those stones. Likewise, he can take other mortar and plaster the house. But suppose the contamination returns, breaking out in the house, after he has pulled out the stones and after he has scraped the house, and it has been replastered. Then the Kohen is to go examine, and behold, if the plague has spread within the house, it is a destructive mildew inside. It is unclean. He is to break down the house, its stones, its timbers, along with all the house's mortar, and carry them out of the city into an unclean place.
So, you got, think about this. Like, if this shows up in your house and it doesn't go away, this wasn't like today. These people spent years sometimes building their house. They'd build like the main room and then they live in it, and then they'd add on and up. They had to tear down the entire house. So a couple things I want us to see in this though. One, obviously this is more than just a physical disease, because we're talking about it getting in the walls.
No, it's not the walls.
So the other thing that I was just thinking is, at this point in their historical journey, where are the children of Israel? They're in the wilderness, yeah. They're in their journey, right? What are they living in? Tents. We're already talking about stone and stuff. So it's just showing us here that God was not just telling them things that they were going to need in that moment. He's setting things in place that are going to follow them throughout their generations.
We're giving them building ordinances.
Yeah, exactly.
So the poor priest, though, he has to take all that stuff out of the city himself.
Yeah.
That's a job.
Yep. So They're, but yeah, and he's setting this stuff up to, we read in Scripture, oh, this is for you throughout your generations, for eternity. All these rules and regulations he's setting up, and sometimes we don't even think about this. They're not even in a house yet.
Yeah.
But he's already setting the guidelines in place so that when they do have a house, they're ready to go. They're already there.
You good?
Yep.
All right. Moreover, whoever goes into the house while it is shut up will be unclean until the evening. The one who lies down in the house must wash his clothes, and he who eats in the house must wash his clothes too. But if the Cohen comes in, inspects it, and behold, the plague has not spread within the house after it was replastered, then he shall pronounce the house clean, because the contamination is healed. In order to cleanse the house, he is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet, and hyssop. He is to kill one of the birds in the clay pot over the living water. Then he is to take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet, and the living bird, and dip them into the blood of the slain bird as well as the living water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, with the living water, with the living bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet.
Okay, we just got to talk about this for just a second. This isn't even my notes. But think about what he's saying here.
Cleanse the house.
What is he cleansing?
It's the house.
The house, right? And the sacrifices that they did for the people, what did it do to the people?
Made him clean.
Correct. But what did it also do? We talked about what does holy mean? Set apart. So when they went through this ceremonial process of these sacrifices for themselves, it set them apart. They became set apart because of them. So now he's saying, let's do the same thing for your house. So think about that. They had to not only were they themselves set apart, their house was set apart. Think about how we can apply that to our lives today. You might be set apart, but is your house set apart? Is what's coming into your house set apart? Is the stuff that's showing on your TV set apart? What in your house is set apart? Right? And if we keep looking at this, what is this a picture of? Look, the hyssop got dipped in blood, sprinkled on the house.
Passover.
We just celebrated Passover. It's the same principles that are being carried out. But not only was that, right? So he took the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet, and the living bird and dipped them into the blood, as well as what? Living water. Right? So we got blood, living water. We see the living bird versus the sacrifice bird, so we've got atonement in there. We see the wood of the cross.
The steak, yeah.
The stake, yeah. So we've got all this right here. I mean, this is just a picture type of redemption, just in these 2 verses.
Wow.
And that's not even in my notes. That was extra. Y'all got that for free.
That's free.
All right, babe, you want to read some more?
I can if you need me to.
Oh, I can. I mean,
Struggling to not.
I just 4. It's just a couple more.
Oh, is it? Go ahead, G.
But he is to let the living bird go out of the city into the open field. So he is to make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. This is the Torah for any mark of Serat, even for a scab, or the Serat in a garment, or for a house, or for a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, to teach when it is unclean, and when it is clean. This is the Torah of Serat.
Any questions on 14? Chapter 14. Let's get this last chapter under our belt, and then we can sit around and talk for forever. We'll talk about campers and stuff. Alright, Leviticus chapter 15. It's the last chapter. Alright, verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moses and said to Aaron, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when any man has a fluid discharged from his body, because of his discharge he is unclean. This is to be his uncleanness in his discharge. Whether his body flows with his discharge or his body obstructs his discharge, it is his uncleanness. Every bed on which he who has the discharge lies will become unclean, and everything he sits on will be unclean. Whoever touches his bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whoever sits on anything on which the man has the discharge sat is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whoever touches the body of the one who has the discharge is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Or if the one who has the discharge spits on someone who is clean, then he also is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening, and then get slapped because he spit on somebody.
Why are we spitting on him?
Any saddle the one who has the discharge rides on will be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him will be unclean until the evening. Whoever carries them is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until evening. Now let's just remember this. Remember, we said this earlier. God is smarter than we are, and they don't have the same sanitary systems that we have. They don't have the
You
same.
don't have a hot shower.
No, they don't have hot showers. I mean, there's a lot of things that they don't have that we take for granted when it comes to sanitation. Also, anyone the person with the discharge touches without rinsing his hands in water should wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. A clay pot that the one with the discharge touches should be broken, and every wooden vessel should be rinsed with water. When the one who has a fluid discharge is cleansed of his issue, then he is to count for himself 7 days for his purification and wash his clothes. Then he is to bathe his body in running water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day he is to take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and come before Adonai at the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest is to offer them, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. So the priest should make atonement for him before Adonai for his fluid discharge. If any man has an emission of semen, then he is to bathe his whole body in water and be unclean until the evening. Every garment and all the leather on it are to be washed with water and will be unclean until the evening. If a man lies with a woman, they should both bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. If a woman has a discharge, and her discharge from her body is blood, she should be in her nidah 7 days, and whoever touches her will be unclean until the evening. Everything that she lies on in her nidah will become unclean. Also everything that she sits on will become unclean. Whoever touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Now remember this. What is the purpose of them separating themselves if they're unclean? What can they not do when they're unclean?
Go to
Touch anything holy.
Yeah, they can't go to the tabernacle. They can't touch anything holy. Why can they not go to the tabernacle?
there unclean.
Yes, but why?
Because it would make it unclean.
Who would it make it? What do you mean by it?
The items in the tent.
Yeah.
So even if they don't touch any of the items in the tabernacle, who are they going to come into contact with in the tabernacle?
The priest.
The priests. The priests have to maintain their set apartness and their cleanness because they are serving. They are touching holy things. If they become unclean and touch something holy, what's going to happen to them?
They're unclean.
There's my
It's a whole.
They're going to die.
Oh,
No.
they're dead.
They're going to die. If they touch a holy thing in an unclean state, we talked about this last week with Aaron's 2 sons, with Abihu and Nadab and Abihu. And then we also talked about it with, what was his name? The touch of the ark when it was falling. If they touched a holy thing in an unclean state, they would die.
So how come nobody dies now? Like, or is there just no more holy things?
No. We talked about this a little bit last week, how I don't think Yah is allowing things to become in the same state of holiness because He knows the state that we're in, and until we get to a place where we can get ourselves clean and set apart, His holiness is, I don't want to say far from us, but it's up, it's off.
That level of manifest presence.
Yes. Whoever touches anything that she sits on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. If it is on the bed or anything where she sits, when he touches it, he will be unclean until the evening. If any man lies with her so that her nadah gets on him, he will be unclean for 7 days, and every bed where he lies will be unclean. Now if a woman has a discharge of her blood for many days, not during her nadah, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her nadah, all the days of the discharge of her uncleanness should be as in the days of her nadah. She is unclean. Every bed where she lies in the days of her discharge will be like her bed during her nadah, and everything she sits on will become unclean, like the uncleanness of her nadah. Whoever touches these things will become unclean and is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, then she is to count off 7 days for herself, and after that she will be clean. On the 8th day she is to take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest is to offer the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, so the priest will make atonement for her before Adonai for the uncleanness of her discharge. So you are to keep the children of Israel separate from their uncleanness, so they will not die What did we just talk about?
Yep.
If they touch something clean, they will not die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. This is the Torah for the one who has a discharge, or for the one who has an emission, which causes him to become unclean, as well as for her who has her period of her nadah, and for the man or the woman who has a discharge, or the one who lies with her who is unclean. And that is Leviticus 15.
So is she having to take an offering monthly?
Yep. To restore. So there are certain things that, so there's progression. So you've got clean and you have unclean, but you also have holy and unholy. Yah's things are holy, right? Yah's things are holy. The best we can get is kind of in that clean state. You know, we're not going to attain Yah's holiness. So we've got a clean state, an unclean state, and then there's an unholy state. So there's certain things that we see with the sacrifices and the offerings that were for different levels. So there were certain things that just, you became unclean, so this just brings you back up to that clean state. Very, very, very different from what we saw with the Zera, where it was like you had to sacrifice all the sacrifices because you were way out of the picture to bring that back into alignment with what Yah's commands were.